Communication technologies have changed a lot over the past 100 or so years. These technologies have shaped our world into what it is today. Many of the technologies and techniques used by the media have been slowly developed over many decades. From the birth of the newspaper all the way to the apps we use today, so much has changed, and yet so much draws on the inventions of the past. Today I want to talk briefly about the history of these technologies as well as the media and the ways it has changed over the years. Before the invention of the radio, people broadcasted information mostly through the word of mouth, newspapers, and posters. The telegraph was invented in the 1830s, and the telephone was invented in 1876, which did help messages spread further, faster, but these needed wire connections and were limited in how far they could reach. Many discoveries and inventions had to happen before the radio could have been invented. The radio was built using principles of electromagnetic radiation theory discovered by the genius physicist James Maxwell in 1864. Nikola Tesla also played a role in the invention of the radio, when he found that he could use his Tesla coils to send and receive radio signals when two coils were tuned to the same frequency. Guillermo Marconi was largely credited with the invention of the radio, even though he largely was using Tesla's technology. Marconi transmitted the first wireless telegraph in 1901 and created the first commercially successful radio system. After its invention, several other scientists and engineers found ways to improve upon the designs of the radio. Radios were the first used by governments and their militaries. Radios were even used in 1912 when the Titanic sank and attributed to saving over 700 lives. Over the years, many more significant improvements such as radio towers, AM, which is amplitude modulation, which allowed for to tune into multiple stations instead of just one, as well as other improvements that allowed radios to be sent over large distances. The first licensed radio station was KDKA out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Its first broadcast took place November 2, 1920, to announce the results of the 1920 Harding versus Cox presidential election. About 1,000 people tuned in. After this, several other first broadcasts took place, like the first broadcast of music at Calvary Episcopal Church in 1921, and the first broadcast of a World Series game in 1953. Millions of Americans began to buy radios. In 1920, the amount of independent radio stations numbered only 8. By the end of 1924, an estimated 3 million radios were being used by Americans to listen to over 1,400 different radio stations. As radios became more common, programming became much more diverse. There were news broadcasts, weather reports, popular music, classical music, opera, sports, and fictional programming. Fictional programming became the most popular in the late 20s and early 30s. There were westerns, mysteries, comedies, romance, and children's shows. During the workday, when most listeners were housewives, romance and drama programs would air. During hours right after school, action and adventure programs would air after school, such as Flash Gordon and Superman. Every night, the whole family might gather around the radio and listen to primetime radio. These shows would have a host and a series of sketch comedies, interviews, and musical performances. They were often performed in front of a live studio audience. Later in the night, there would be prestige dramas, where major Hollywood actors might recreate movies or act out adaptations of literature. The radio was also very effective for broadcasting the news. If breaking news was taking place, you may hear, "We interrupt this broadcast," followed by an important news story. Sometimes they would even have a live man on scene broadcasting from where the news was taking place, and giving a first-person account of what was happening. Radio programs were often sponsored by different products, such as coffee, food, medicine, and even cars. In a way, this is the earliest form of commercials. Radio changed Americans' home life. People would even have radio parties where they would invite people over and listen to the radio together. In the 1930s, broadcasting surpassed the popularity of newspapers and print media. The radio was much more mentally and emotionally stimulating than print news could ever be. Radio was alive and could be felt, while print news was flat in comparison. Radio could also reach people who were illiterate. The radio was incredibly popular as an auditory medium, but magazines, newspapers, and other forms of print media were still very popular as visual mediums. The advent of the radio did not necessarily directly compete with print media, as both had different inherent benefits. These early days of radio also set the stage and provided the framework for how television would be in early days. In the late 40s and early 50s, television came and took over much of what the radio had to offer, including many of its dramas, sports, and news channels. Although many thought the radio was doomed, it still held up as a great way to listen to music, which became its main function for the second half of the century. During the 50s, many stations created their own playlists ranging from 30 to 50 songs they would play on repeat daily. This trend of repeated playlists has basically continued to this day, though radio is slowly becoming a thing of the past now that we have online music streaming services such as YouTube, Spotify, and Pandora. Television was invented over several decades beginning in the 1800s, but becoming a reality in the 1900s. Television largely used the same methods as radio to broadcast from far distances, with a few major differences. By around 1950, there were over a million television sets in the United States. By 1953, there were over 20 million. Television has evolved dramatically since the 50s. As stated earlier, a lot of the things that were happening on radio were also done on television. Dramas, operas, music, sports, news, and everything else that was done on the radio was done on television. The TV was also a great place to advertise and changed everything in that respect. The TV was highly influential to American society and culture. The internet has been developing for over 50 years and has a very long, complex history. It didn't reach mass adoption until the 90s, but it was still primitive at this time. However, it did open up the ability for people to communicate with each other around the world. When social media was created, it changed everything. Everyone has become extremely connected over the internet, and it has been easier than ever to share media with each other, as well as to speak your own voice and create your own following. The internet changed the world in so many ways and has progressed humanity tremendously.